The animal was taken by a hunter in December in Otsego County during the legal small game season for coyote. And when the individual took the animal, they remarked upon its large size, and they reached out to the DEC and others basically letting folks know that they took this very large animal, and they were curious, and they wanted folks to know, and they voluntarily offered a sample of the tissue of the animal so it could be screened for further assessment to basically determine whether or not it was a coyote or something else. The hunter provided tissue samples both to us, our wildlife health program, and to the Maine Wolf Coalition, a third party that's interested in wolf restoration in the Northeast. Our folks coordinated with the East Stroudsburg University Wildlife Forensics Lab that they use on a regular basis, usually in conjunction with law enforcement requests for species identification. So if they seize a hide or a part of an animal, this would be the lab that they would send the tissue sample to for species identification. The results that came back from that test did indicate that in the nuclear DNA of the animal, there was a high concentration of wolf DNA, but in the mitochondrial DNA, the DNA that only comes from the mother, they concluded that it was all eastern coyote. So based on that determination, they said that the animal most closely was associated with coyote identification. The other test, the second test that was paid for by the folks from the Maine Wolf Coalition, they went to Trent University. They ran a different series of tests, different series of genetics tests against different reference samples, and they came back with results that attributed the mother to an eastern wolf and the majority of the nuclear DNA to a Great Lakes wolf, but other portions of the animal seem to be more similar to either far western wolves or eastern wolves. The third sample, which was from the same animal, and it was actually a subset of the sample that the hunter had sent to the Maine Wolf Coalition, was sent to Princeton University essentially as a third potential option. We were aware of that sample going to Princeton University, and we were in contact with the lab there so that we could be apprised of the results. Those results just came out a couple days ago, and these test results really just focused on nuclear DNA, and the outcome of that assessment was essentially that the animal was 97% similar to a Great Lakes wolf, with very little coyote DNA present. So, based on the corroboration of those three test results on the nuclear side of the equation, that is, all of them agreed that it was mostly wolf, and the physical size of the animal, which was 85 pounds, which is considerably larger than your average coyote in New York State. New York has decided that the animal is most closely identified as a wolf. Which population it comes from, we don't know, but definitely wolf. The reason why genetic testing came into play here is that eastern coyotes in general are much larger than the coyote that most folks think of as being out in the deserts and associate with the western United States. The eastern coyote is a relatively new resident to the Northeast. They weren't present here until about 100 years ago as they started to move east from those western states. And it appears, based on genetic studies, that as they move east, there was some intermingling of coyotes with resident wolves, both up in the Great Lakes and ultimately up in Canada. Physically, they're still smaller in size than a wolf, but they're larger than a coyote, and some of the behaviors that they've adopted in the Northeast are more wolf-like. They'll take larger prey instead of just focusing on small mammals like the western coyotes do. And we're starting to see, over the last few decades, more of a movement of coyotes towards taking larger prey, even up to the size of deer. The presence of a wolf in New York has raised the question about how likely it is that the species can repopulate New York State, become reestablished. One of the outstanding questions that hasn't been answered, and we're not sure it can be answered at this point, is where this individual animal actually came from. Certainly, it's possible that it made a long-distance movement from one of the Great Lakes states and did make it successfully into eastern New York. Rare things can happen. That animal could have made it successfully across that intervening landscape. However, the frequency of these events is probably very low. The few occurrences that have been reported in the Northeast within the last 20 years are male animals. It's generally consistent with mammals in general and large mammals in particular, that it's males that tend to make these long-distance movements as they move away from essentially their natal home range and go in search of opportunities to find mates and essentially establish a breeding group of their own. As long as it's only males that are moving into a new area, there's really no potential for a new population to be established. You basically need the females present in order to actually have the interbreeding and ultimately, in the case of wolves, having pack formation. Really the best way for a new population to really establish in New York was if a pack actually moved into New York. Given the fact that, at least from the Great Lakes population, the nearest pack is several hundred miles away, that doesn't seem likely in the near future. There are wolves closer to New York, up in Ontario. The wolves that are referred to as eastern wolves in Algonquin Provincial Park come within 60 miles of the New York border. That would seem a more likely avenue for animals to make it into New York, but again, that same issue, that individual animals don't really have the ability to establish a population on their own. A further complication is, again, as I mentioned earlier, that one of the issues with the eastern coyote is the fact that they already have a certain amount of wolf DNA present. That's because wolves and coyotes do readily interbreed, particularly when the wolves in particular don't have the option of breeding with other wolves. And as a result of that, we would expect that individual animals that move into New York, while they might be able to survive because the habitat is suitable, there's certainly prey for them to eat, they're likely going to be breeding with the resident coyotes. And this tends to muddy the situation and make it harder from a management perspective to be able to delineate essentially what is a coyote, what is a wolf, and how do you manage for them. So the primary way wildlife is restored to any particular location, before anything else can happen, the appropriate habitat has to be present. If all you did was pick animals up and move them into an area where, for whatever reason, they'd been extirpated without addressing the causes that led to that animal being absent, there's no reason to expect those animals to stick around. An appropriate restoration method is always going to focus on making sure that there's suitable habitat present. For most wildlife in New York State, for most of the species that have been present within the state within the last couple hundred years, for the most part, since the DEC has been formed, we've been very proactive at protecting habitat and trying to reestablish suitable habitat for the entire array of fish and wildlife species in New York State. Wolves are no exception. There's been so much forest protection within New York State, the establishment of the Catskill Park, the Adirondack Park, the forest protection programs, even things such as the tax incentives under the 480A law to try to improve private forest management. New York is continuing to put a lot of resources into continuing that acquisition program. We work with our fellow agencies and other conservation partners to help promote and support their pursuit of being able to set aside and manage habitats appropriately. And for that reason, there's a lot of optimism, and we've seen that play out over the last few decades with the return of moose of their own volition, moving back into the state from the Vermont and Massachusetts border and occupying suitable habitat in northeastern New York. We've seen that with Great Lakes piping plover, which hadn't been present in the state since 1983, but with their habitat being present on the eastern shore of Lake Ontario within the last 4 years. We've had several pairs move back, and they've been successful. So it is definitely possible to get populations to reestablish without having to go, the whole 9 yards and going and grabbing animals and bringing them into the state. Obviously, one of the things that would be a barrier to wolf restoration would be if every wolf that came into New York was killed. One of the ways that we can address that is by working with the hunting and trapping community to make sure that they know how to differentiate between the two species. Obviously, there's some complications, as we mentioned before, because of some of the genetic similarities. Our coyotes tend to be larger. There is a fair amount of overlap between a lot of the physical features in these species. But having said that, and as exemplified by this particular example, where the animal was considerably larger than our native coyotes, we can provide guidance to hunters and trappers as to help identify animals, at least at close range, how to be able to differentiate between a wolf and a coyote. And one of the actions that we're taking as we're conducting this interview, our web pages are being updated to provide some visual cues that hunters could use, and basically just some guidance on how to differentiate and what circumstances that they might want to avoid pulling the trigger on a particular animal, and instead report that sighting to us here so we can be aware of it. I think folks are very excited about wolves and the potential for wolves to come back to New York. The state would love to see the full complement of our former biodiversity reestablished, and obviously wolves would sort of be that pinnacle top predator to kind of sort of put the cherry on the top of the work that the Department of Environmental Conservation has been doing for the past 50 years. But as we talked about, it's not just a matter of having that habitat on the landscape. The species has to cooperate, and more importantly, the public has to cooperate. And I think before there's any significant effort to actively restore the wolf in New York, the department's going to have to know that the people of New York want that work to be done and are willing to basically do the hard work necessary to make that happen.